Talk seminerimizin bir bölümünü Arda Gitmez Hoca katılacak. Bu seminerde Political Economy, Institutional Technology adlı sunumunu gerçekleştirecek. Arda Hocam sözü sizlere bırakalım. Hoş geldiniz.
Çok teşekkürler, çok sağ olun. Davet için çok teşekkürler, organizasyon için çok teşekkürler. Burada olmak büyük bir onur. Bir noktada İngilizceye geçmem gerekecek ne yazık ki çünkü yani bir sorayım yani. Is it okay if I speak in Turkish occasionally? Is there anybody whose native language is not Turkish? Alright, so I think the main medium of talk is still gonna be in English, but occasionally maybe I might revert to Turkish. Alright, so my name is Arda Gitmez. I am a faculty member at Bilkent University, Department of Economics. And so once again, thank you very much for the organization. The purpose of this talk is hopefully getting at least some of you interested in some of the recent issues on political economy. My areas of interest are sort of diverse, but nowadays I'm working more on political economy, the theoretical issues related to political economy. And I'm teaching a course on political economy in Bilkent as well. So when I sort of got this invitation, my initial thought was that, these are some of the more recent issues on political economy that I would like to talk about. This is a still growing area of research, especially in the last 20 years, like in the issues of institutions and how to empirically sort of think about the effect of institutions and evolution of institutions. And so what I plan to do is that basically sort of give you like a helicopter tour of the recent literature on political economy institutions. And then in the last part of the talk, and then in the podcast that follows, maybe we're going to have more chances to talk about how these issues on institutions give us a framework to also think about technological change and what's waiting us in the next 10, 15, maybe 50 years. So basically this is once again a helicopter tour. So the way that I want to start this lecture is basically introducing you to maybe to some sort of broadly defined notion of political economy. So when I teach political economy, I start the first lecture with this question, of course, what is political economy? And then I have a very easy and kind of boring answer. This is the subfield of economics that studies politics. So I know that this is not an interesting answer in the sense that, of course, you study anything from an economic perspective, you call it blah, blah, blah economy. So the same thing. But I think sort of things become interesting when we dig deeper into these issues. So the way that we think about political economy as economists is that it's sort of a subfield that includes a bunch of studies. So a part of this field includes studies about the choice of policies by the society, which we call collective decision making. And I think some of you are actually learning about this already, right? So Arrow's impossibility theorem, Gilbert-Satterthwaite theorem. Like theoretically, is it even possible to sort of think about a way of aggregating preferences in a meaningful manner? Is it even possible to do this? And then the answer turns out to be typically no. And then sort of we think about, okay, so what are some sort of indirect mechanisms to aggregate the preferences? There is a field within, there is a group within political economists that study voter behavior, why people go ahead and bother going to the voting booth. How do they vote? Do they act strategically? Do they act sincerely? Where are their preferences coming from? Like if you prefer higher redistribution or lower this redistribution, what are the sources of these preferences? Do your future expectations play a role? Do your past experiences play a role, and etc.? There is a deep literature on this. There is also a bunch of people who are working on politician behaviors, how to keep the politicians accountable, how to give them the right incentives. There is a group of people who study institutions. I'm going to skip this for now because we're going to talk about this more. And then there is also a group of people who study how media and judiciary and collective action interacts with all of these things above. Some of my more recent papers are about media and collective action and how sort of they feed into these general political environment in a setting. So, but then again, this is a very broadly defined, of course, definition. You might still be asking the following questions. Okay, so what we seem to be doing, therefore, is just taking some of the questions that might be of general interest, that are broadly related to politics, and then studying it from the perspective of economics, right? So that means that the political economy, in my opinion, is going to be less about the subject matter, because everything is about politics, or you can make everything about politics. It is more about the sort of the way that we approach topics. And I think like a good illustration of what sets political economy from other fields is the following. Like there is a field of economics called public finance. Broadly defined, this is like about the issues of how to handle public finances, how to set up a tax policy in a way that's both redistributive enough, but also gives people enough incentives to work and etc. And then when you take a course on public finance, inevitably you come up with a characterization of the optimal tax scheme. Right? So this is more or less taxation, how sort of the optimal tax scheme looks like. So that's not the end of the question in the following sense. We can characterize this optimal policy, but then if you look at the real life, we see these optimal things rarely being implemented in reality, right? And that is the point where the political economy kind of tries to take over from public finance. Like it's not just about the characterization of the optimal policy, but about the study of when and how this optimal policy actually gets implemented, and if not, what's the obstacles behind it? Is it the voters' preferences? Is it the politicians? Is it the institutions, and etc.? So that makes this an interesting and worthwhile topic to study. Another question that you might have, I guess, is that, Hocam, all you have been saying so far is that we are studying politics, so why are you not calling yourself a political scientist? Which I think is a very fair question. To be honest, I think like the boundary between political science and political economy is actually very blurry. When I teach political economy or when I write papers, I cite a bunch of political science papers. I know that a bunch of political scientists also cite political economists. The main distinction that I would like to bring is that I want to sort of emphasize that the political economy methodologically remains very econ-oriented. What do I mean by this? So there is a certain way of working with economic models that we all get sort of indoctrinated into, beginning with Econ 101, right? So you set up by starting an economic model, which is a bunch of agents. And all of these agents have some preferences and some constraints. And then these agents optimize, and then these agents interact, and then there is an equilibrium. That framework still is like the sort of the main canonical framework that we adopt in political economy. That's less of a case in political science, although I have to admit that, like once again, there is like a lot of overlap. Also, when we do empirics, we sort of really remain focused on doing causal identification, which is sort of establishing causal relationships between variables, making sure that we can actually claim that in this setting, X is the reason that Y changes, and etc. That is something that political scientists are still, and I don't want to criticize the field overall, but I mean, so in my sort of observation, so economists are really sort of hooked up on this like causality, and then the methods that we are developing have been sort of more cutting edge compared to the other fields. That's my sort of broad definition of political economy and my broad defenses why it's a valuable field. And then, once again, for the rest of this hour, I could have talked about any of the things that are on the previous slides, voter behavior, collective decision making, and etc. I want to talk about something that I really find interesting, which is institutions. So I really want to sort of bring this to the forefront because it is a topic dear to my heart. I think it's also like a good sort of conversation starter. Like everybody should be at least a little bit knowledgeable about the recent research on institutions and etc. So why not talk about this, okay? So we have to once again begin with a definition of what an institution is. It's not an easy thing to do. I'm going to give you a definition. Half of you are not going to be satisfied with that definition. That's a very common experience. The literature complains about this lack of like proper definition of institutions. But I think the best sort of definition of institutions that we have in the literature is coming from Douglas North. Douglas North is sort of like the founding father of this field. He won the Nobel Prize in like early 90s, and then this like more recent research, empirical research on institutions, Acemoglu, Robinson, Johnson, and etc. It kind of follows up from Douglas North. And sort of Douglas North has this sort of review article that he got published in Journal of Economic Perspective, where he defines institutions in the following way. These are the humanly devised constraints that structure political, economic, and social interaction. They consist of both informal constraints that might include sanctions, taboos, customs, traditions, and codes of conduct, or formal rules, constitutions, laws, property rights, right? So there are sort of three things that I want to emphasize about this thing. So the first one is that these are humanly devised things. So an institution is necessarily something that does not exist in nature, so humans came up with it. It's not like geography. Second, these are constraints. So these set up sort of what you can do and what you cannot do, broadly defined. And third, like the definition of what you can do and what you cannot do can be contained in the formal institutions, which is like a written law stating that this is the allowed and this is not. On top of it, it can be informally defined. Like these are like rules of the game, but on top of it also the consequence of trying to break these rules, right? So this is how I think about institutions. Like what shapes our interactions? There is like a broadly defined set of rules. We're playing soccer, and then if you're playing soccer with sort of in your neighborhood with your friends, you get to set up some rules, right? So if you have 3 corner kicks, then it becomes a penalty, and etc. These are the set of rules. But then there is the informal institutions that support this, like the idea that if the owner of the ball takes the ball and tries to run away with it, there will be some social consequences. Like people are going to confront you next time that you play, and etc. So that means that rule, that sort of consequence of trying to break those rules, also become a part of the definition of institutions, right? A lot of people dislike this definition because it feels like, vibes overly defined. So what's an institution? Basically, anything can be an institution. The literature has tried to make some progress and etc. But then, admittedly, we're still getting there. One thing that we do know, however, here is that institutions actually matter. They matter for political and social outcomes. They also matter for economic outcomes. So let me start by giving you an example of how they matter for political outcomes. And I actually want to emphasize the following. Like there's like informal institutions, the social expectations, the consequence of breaking the rules, like what you can and what you cannot do, and what are the social sort of implications attached with those type of things, is an important sort of determinant of institutions, and they actually determine the outcomes. There is a very nice example that is coming from this book, Levitsky and Ziblatt. And Levitsky and Ziblatt has this book called How Democracies Die, which I think is like a brilliant book. So you should check it out if you're interested. But in that book, they have this example where they sort of compare the institutions in 2 different countries. They start with this example from Argentina, 1946. The president of Argentina is Juan Perón, very famous figure in Argentinian politics. He was like a populist, like one of the sort of most famous populist sort of politicians in 20th century. And when I say populist, I don't mean to attach it with a bad connotation. It's just how it's defined. 1946, Argentinian Supreme Court resists his attempts by ruling some of his attempts unconstitutional. And in response, what Perón does is that he just goes ahead and impeaches 3 out of the 5 members. He forces them to retire and changes the Supreme Court. And then it becomes a new norm in Argentinian politics. Whenever a new political transition occurs, the incoming regime has the sort of right, so to speak, to replace the Supreme Court members. Right? This now becomes a political tradition. You might imagine that if Perón can do this, and it's of course like a very sort of advantageous thing to do for any politician, other people might try to do the same thing. Of course, other people try to do the same thing. In the United States, 1935, Roosevelt, legendary president of United States, he sort of led the country through the Second World War, took them out of this like Great Depression and etc. 1935, he's like super popular at this point, right? So the country is out of the recession, and like he's super popular. And then he wants to institute this thing that he calls New Deal, which is some sort of like a center-left sort of set of policy measures. Supreme Court resists his attempts by ruling some of them unconstitutional. Roosevelt hates it. Just like what Perón did, he proposed a judicial reform for court packing, which is like increasing the number of judges in the Supreme Court. And then that allows him, of course, to appoint new judges and then maintain a majority in Supreme Court. I want to point out that he's hugely popular at this point. He has majorities in both houses, in the Senate and in the Congress. So if the Democratic Party goes with Roosevelt's recommendation, he can definitely do this, but he has immense resistance from inside the party. He was not successful. People resisted. Even people like in his party resisted, and he was not able to sort of pass this reform, right? What I want to point out here is that Argentina and United States, both democracies, they have an operating constitution, right? So, I mean, the formal rules are sort of very, very similar, comparable to each other. But it turns out that there is something that distinguishes these 2 countries, and that's sort of like the informal rules that hold place in these decades, right? It also turns out that, what this implies here is that not just the formal rules, but the informal rules are also important for political outcomes, right? So this is just an example, but of course, as economists, as we always would like to emphasize, we want to work with a little bit data and etc. So is there more evidence that, empirical evidence that the institutions matter? And also, is there evidence that institutions matter for economic outcomes? There are a bunch of papers that I would like to talk about. So here's one paper by Acemoğlu, Restrepo, Naidu, and Robinson that was published in 2019, where they are sort of looking at the following. Think about transition to democracy in a country and then think about the growth afterwards, and then the broadly defined the question is, does transition to democracy increase your growth rate? And of course, there is like a huge problem of endogeneity here, like transition to democracy is not exogenous. Just, I mean, in my opinion, they do what they can do with respect to sort of taking care of this endogeneity, and the type of graph that they obtain here is the following. So year 0 is the democratization of the typical country in their sample. These are the preceding years, and as you can see, like the growth is sort of kind of on the negative region, but statistically insignificant. But after the transition, you can see like the growth is sort of picking up, right? So this is kind of sort of the visual proof that formal institutions, which is the transition to democracy, a multi-party system, free and fair competitive elections, and etc., is good for growth, right? There is also sort of empirical evidence that supports the idea that informal institutions are important in determining economic outcomes. This is a paper, this is a graph that I take from a paper by Guido Tabellini. He published this in Journal of European Economic Association in 2010. So he looks at different regions in Europe. And then he has a measure of trust across individuals from each of these regions. So each dot in this graph is a region in Europe. On the x-axis, this is a measure of sort of interpersonal trust across the members of the society. And he is coming this from surveys and etc. And the y-axis is the output GDP per capita of these regions. And what you can see here is that once again, there is like a very clear positive relationship between these two. That means that interpersonal trust is kind of associated with higher growth. You might be worried about the endogeneity in this graph as well. I would be very worried about the endogeneity. Like this does not establish any causality. Just take my word that people are aware of these problems and then they are trying to take care of these type of issues as well. But this is once again an interesting thing, right? So I mean, it basically tells you that keeping other things equal, higher interpersonal trust, which is a measure of sort of these like how effective your informal institutions are, is affiliated with higher output, higher productivity. Why is this the case? You can come up with various stories about it. There are a lot of stories that sort of emphasize property rights and their enforceability and etc. So there is also like so this sort of you can see that a bunch of dots here are in Italy. It's sort of not surprising. Tabellini is from Italy, so he sort of is hooked up on Italy a lot. But basically, what I want to argue here is that this type of argument kind of goes back to Putnam, a very famous political scientist who wrote this book in 1992, making sort of. I forgot the name of the book now. I'm sorry, I'm getting old. Making Democracy Work. So he has this book where he sort of looks at the long-run differences across different regions in Italy, specifically in north and southern Italy. And then he has a theory that explains why northern Italy is more economically developed than southern Italy. The stereotypical thing that you need to know here is that Italy is sort of like northern and southern Italy are like culturally and economically very different from each other. When you think about northern Italy, what you should think about is like Milano and then all the fashion shows and like the Gucci bags and etc. Like very cosmopolitan version of Italy. And the southern Italy is like Naples, Napoli, the mafia and etc. Of course this is like it's a caricaturization, but so this is also like sort of aligned with like the typical sort of stereotypical northern and southern Italian in an Italian's mind. And then if you look at any statistics about Italy, it literally looks like this. Like northern Italy, the region where Milano is and Turin is sort of very developed, and then midern part of Italy where Rome and Florence is like kind of okay, and then the southern part, Sicily and sort of Naples and etc., they are doing terrible across any metric, right? And then the reason is that why is this the case? Of course, these are the members of the same country. The formal institutions are very, very similar. The reason is informal institutions, right? This also reminds me of like another sort of figure that I see a lot. Think about this graph and then think about the last time that you have seen this graph. I think you are seeing like a related version of this graph. Think about any statistics about the world. And then like green corresponds to good, broadly defined, and red corresponds to bad. And then any statistics about the world kind of look like this. Like, I mean, GDP per capita, and rule of law, like media freedom, whatever, right? Life expectancy, and etc. And the reason is sort of, once again, long run, there are some differences between the institutions of these sort of countries that lead to these like sort of the divergence between the political outcomes of these regions. Broadly defined, I mean, so the literature on institutions is sort of hooked up on this picture, motivated by this picture, trying to understand this picture. Right? Why is this the case that, you know, every single statistics in the world is looking like this graph and nothing else? If you have seen, I mean, of course, one of the most recent contributors on this literature is Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson. They also won the Nobel Prize for this for the last year. And 2 days ago, I was sort of watching Daron Acemoglu's talk, like his Nobel lecture, just to refresh my memory and prepare for this lecture. And then he actually starts with a graph that looks like this. I mean, of course, he doesn't put this in the meme format, but he sort of puts a graph of like different countries' growth rates and then says that this is what motivated me to study economics. So I think that's a fair characterization to say that, you know, this is sort of the motivating picture behind all of these literature on institutions. So a part of the literature on institutions, which I could go into more detail, but given the sort of limited time, I'm not going to do, really sort of establishes this link that I kind of was talking about. The institutions determine economic outcomes. This is part of the framework. But the other part of the literature, a bunch of scholars also try to establish the link that I'm about to talk about, which is the following. So the way that these institutions evolve and change over time is also not exogenous. What an institution is that it's a set of rules that govern the interactions among people. But it basically determines this like power structure within a society. And when you set the power structure within a society, basically you give these people the ability to set the next period institutions. That allows you to come up with like a broad framework that does not only just explain what's happening in this period, but also in the long run, right? But in order to understand this, we need to develop a general sort of understanding is how institutions evolve over time, which is what I want to talk in the next 10, 15 minutes, right? So there is this literature over here. Now I want to talk about the literature that corresponds to the link above, like how institutions evolve over time. And I want to start by pointing out the following. Institutional growth is not an easy thing. Unlike many examples of economic interactions that we see in our lectures, you might very easily end up with inefficient outcomes. Here is an illustration of this principle, which I think is sort of driving the example behind this like sort of literature on institutional evolution. So this is an example that Daron Acemoglu has in his lecture notes, and I think this is sort of very illuminative of sort of how the literature sort of started thinking about these issues. Imagine that there are 3 possible institutions. One is the absolutism. In Turkish, this is what we call the mutlakiyet. And then constitutional monarchy, which corresponds to roughly like meşrutiyet. And then democracy is like the cumhuriyet, right? So there are these like 3 different institutional arrangements. And of course, the moment that you start thinking about institutional change, you need to think about different groups within the society. So let's imagine, for simplicity, that there are only 2 groups in the society that we are talking about, the elite and the middle class. The difference between these institutions here is that the payoffs are different, but also the power structures are different in the following sense. Imagine that under an absolutism institution, an absolutist institution, it is the elites who decide what happens in the next period. And imagine that in a constitutional monarchy and democracy, it is the middle class. So you give up you willingly kind of give up these like property rights, decision rights to the middle class. Let's imagine that the payoffs are like this. You don't have to worry about where these are coming from, but I think these are sort of realistic payoffs. Suppose that from the perspective of the elite, the best thing is a constitutional monarchy. It's sort of like a middle ground where you give some of these incentives to the workers to work hard, but also maintain some of the capital. And then the next best thing is absolutism, and then the worst thing is democracy. And now imagine that from the perspective of the middle class, the best thing is democracy, then the constitutional monarchy, then the absolutism. You can come up with different ways of justifying these payoff functions, but what I want to emphasize here is the following. Look at these payoff functions and realize that a constitutional monarchy is better than an absolutism for both of these parties. Therefore, it is what we call a Pareto improvement. In any sensible notion of sort of economic progress, beginning with an absolutist institution, we should find a way of moving into a constitutional monarchy, right? Everybody wants it. Why wouldn't we want it? So let's start let's now think about this from the political economy perspective and imagine that we start with absolutism. In absolutism, you are the elite, you are deciding what happens in the next period. If you are a very short-sighted elite, of course, what you would do here is that you would go to constitutional monarchy because that's sort of gonna increase your payoff right now. But imagine that you are like a very far-sighted elite who realize that things are gonna change in the future periods. And the moment that you are a far-sighted elite, a forward-looking elite, you are gonna realize the following. If I move to constitutional monarchy in this period, I'm gonna give all the decision rights to the middle class. And then beginning with the next period onwards, they're gonna try to move to democracy. That's gonna take all my payoffs all the way back to this, the lowest payoff that I could get, right? That means that as long as your elites are sufficiently forward-looking, they're gonna resist this transition. That would benefit everybody. Which is like, I mean, of course, like a very simple example, but I think this is sort of very illustrative. Like, I mean, so in economics, Econ 101, we learn about these sort of cohesion sort of arguments that, you know, if there is an efficient way of doing things, the people are gonna find ways of sort of implementing it and etc. And this is a counterexample. And the reason why there is a counterexample here is that, you know, different institutions give different power structures. And then if you are forward-looking, you're gonna have to think about how these power structures evolve over time, right? But I mean, broadly speaking, this is an example of why institutional change is hard, why there is inertia, why there is resistance to this economic progress. So that being said, I mean, institutional change is still possible. And when institutional change occurs, actually, it might even benefit the elites. So here is an example that I would like to sort of show you from one of the earliest examples of these like empirical literature on institutions. This is from a paper by Douglas North and his co-author Weingast that was published in 1989. This is like one of the most influential papers because it's one of the earliest examples of this literature that talks about institutions with data. The paper does not do any causal identification, but still like the fact that it sort of uses data to explain something is very interesting. What they are looking in this paper here is that they are looking at the United Kingdom, Britain, and they are specifically investigating this thing that's called the Glorious Revolution, which is kind of a transition to a constitutional monarchy in Britain. So it's like a sort of a democratizing sort of step. And it's a revolution that means that, you know, like these like sort of, not the king, but the people around the king sort of came up with sufficient sort of threats to sort of induce the king to sort of take this sort of democratizing step. So here is the sort of, so what they are doing in this paper here is that they are sort of listing these government expenditures before and after the Glorious Revolution. And what I want to show you here is that after this democratizing step, the government actually is able to spend more. It also is able to take more debt. So before that, it's just the government who is just, you know, find its own money. But now the government is now able to take debt and then sort of implement it to use different things. And then what's more striking here is that post-Glorious Revolution, so the interest rate on the government debt, as you can see here, is like consistently decreasing. So people are not just willing to lend to the government, but they are willing to lend to the government at lower interest rates. The government is able to fund its expenditures in a cheaper way. Why is this the case? North and Weingast's argument here is that this is happening because of the transition to the democracy, not democracy, but this is happening because of the Glorious Revolution. Before the Glorious Revolution, the king had more power. That means that the king could just seize your assets or just refuse to pay any debt. Now we had a step towards democracy. People broadly agree that the king, whatever debt that they have to pay it back. That makes it more credible and therefore a less risky investment to give a debt to the king, and therefore people are more willing to do it at cheaper rates, right? So what you can see here is that if the government can somehow sort of willingly give up its power to seize the assets and then take away or like, just outright refuse to pay its debt, it's actually kind of paradoxically beneficial even to the government. Because now you are setting a credible environment where you can take debt and then promise to pay it back. And then it allows you to increase your expenditures, right? So this is an example of an institutional change that actually kind of benefits everybody, the king itself. And the reason why this is happening is because there is a revolution. That means that, once again, I'm going to give you like a very simplified argument. But it's sort of basically a revolution happens because the people around the king goes to the king and say that if you don't take the step, we are going to take it in your behalf by killing you, right? So, and then if this sort of collective action problem is resolved, then you can actually take the steps. What I'm trying to say here is that institutional change is difficult. Nevertheless, still possible if people can solve their collective action problems. And it can benefit everybody. So there is a related argument by Ajemoğlu and Robinson. I'm going to skip it in the interest of time. Another reason why institutional change is hard is the following. So far, I'm giving you some examples. And in these examples, I'm sort of thinking about this sort of set of available institutions as kind of exogenously given. So there is constitutional monarchy. It's an idea and institution available to us. And democracy, it's an idea and institution available to us. In reality, these ideas do not just pop up from everywhere. You need to also have the right set of institutions to support the development of these ideas. Joel Mokyr, this year's Nobel Prize winner, has this like brilliant book where he talks about in his view, the reason why the Industrial Revolution took place in England and nowhere else. And his explanation is that it had the right type of culture that support the development of the right type of ideas that allowed these scientists to sort of develop a new type of relationship with the nature and etc. And then it becomes like a more sort of scientific culture. You might agree or disagree, but I think one thing is given. So you cannot just have an industrial revolution or a glorious revolution or some type of sort of political transition out of nowhere. You need to have the right solution to the collective action problem. Like people need to come together and then sort of demand this. And also people need to have the right type of idea to sort of back that up. Like this is the type of institution that we want to implement. That means that somebody has to think of this idea, right? Some shameless advertising, but I also want to talk about a paper of mine that's sort of on a related topic. So I have a working paper with James Robinson and Mehdi Shadmehr, where we kind of argue that you look at this like sort of Islamic tradition, and then you see very little emphasis on the democratic institutions, especially compared to the comparable text that we see in the Western literature. And we try to argue why. And then sort of once again, our argument here is that so some of these notions of democracy, representative democracy and policy making is really sort of unthinkable to the Islamic scholars of the time, which are very brilliant people. They are extremely smart. They know what they are doing. But the idea of like a democratic transition, where like the notion of a democracy in the sense that we understand in the Western world is really sort of inconceivable to them. And we have two sort of examples from two very prominent Islamic thinkers that sort of kind of support this argument. One is Ibn Rushd, where he talks about sort of Aristotle's texts. So, brilliant person. He actually knows about Aristotle, like ancient Greek. He reads this ancient Greek. And this is this takeaway from his reading of Aristotle. He says that perhaps the laws instituted in these cities, ancient Greek cities, were definitive, invariable, and permanent, as in the case of our Islamic law. And perhaps these cities did not have definite laws, but the matter was delegated to those who held the power, depending on what was more useful at each moment, as in the case of Byzantine laws. So what he's saying here is the following. Look, we are starting with an advantage because we have an Islamic law, we know what to do. Therefore, there is no need for a policy-making institution. We don't even need a parliament. We just know what to do. We just need a ruler to implement this. And then he's saying that, look, ancient Greeks did not have this, so they needed to come up with a notion of a parliament and then a notion of democracy, right? And then sort of, we think that this is one reason why sort of there is like less emphasis on like sort of these like a democratically selected parliament and then a notion of democracy in the Western sense in the Eastern world. There is also an example from Ibn Khaldun where he sort of, once again, brilliant thinker, he says the religious laws govern all governmental positions and apply to each one of them in all its aspects because the religious law governs all the actions of human beings. Jurists, therefore, which are these like people who are responsible of making sure that we implement the religious law, are concerned with the rank of the ruler and sultan and with the conditions under which it is assumed. Furthermore, they are concerned with the causes that necessitate the removal of a ruler. So what he's saying here is the following, and this is actually like very sort of, so if you read about it, you are saying that, okay, so he's getting very, very, very close to the notion that we should have a parliament to control the ruler and then prevent them from sort of implementing what they need to do. And then the next natural step, if you were like a Western thinker, would be something like, oh, bring a parliament that represents the interests of the different people together and let them sort out policy making. He kind of sort of circumvents it. He directly goes to saying the following. Look, therefore we need a council, and then what this council is going to do is to specify the causes that necessitate the removal. So he's saying that, look, I'm not going to be even interested in policy making. I'm just going to be interested in specifying the cases in which it's justified to remove a ruler. And I think we think that one reason why he's sort of thinking like this here is that he doesn't even need to understand sort of how the policy making needs to be done, because in his mind, it's just, what you need to do is just set by the Islamic law, right? So once again, what I'm trying to do here is that, of course, I mean, this is just one example, and then Mocker's book was another example. But the idea here is that not just you need to have the right society and the right power structure, but also the right set of ideas to develop with the sort of your institutions to make some political transitions. All right, so in the next sort of 5 to 10 minutes, let me give you a couple more examples on sort of how institutions evolve, and then these are going to be examples of like the more recent literature on institutional evolution. There are several theories of how institutions evolve. One very famous theory is what people call the Tilly hypothesis. Charles Tilly is an historian, sociologist, and then he has this idea about how the state came up to be. That can be summarized in a sort of very sort of striking quote. He says that war made the state and the state made war. State made war because part is sort of obvious. What's interesting here is the war made the state. So he thinks that historically the reason why the apparatus of a state, which is the precursor of all these like democratic sort of institutions, is that there was war. There was conflict. When there is conflict, you need to set up an army. You need to fund the army. That means that you need to find the taxation apparatus. And then when the conflict is over, the taxation apparatus still is going to be there. That means that the state is going to have some presence. And then in the long run, that's going to evolve into some sort of a stronger state. That's the Tilly hypothesis, right? Beasley and Person look at sort of, in a paper published in 2009, they are looking at this like the incidence of external conflict in Europe. And then they are finding out that actually it's like a very good predictor of the economic development recently. Let me not go through this like whole detail of the paper, but this is the argument. Like historically, the incidence of conflict in a region predicts the economic development today, which is like striking. And then that's like a sort of supporting argument in favor of the Tilly hypothesis. More recently, 2025, and I'm putting this here because I want to emphasize that this is like sort of still very active research. Sasha Becker and some co-authors conduct a similar exercise in Germany, and then they look at sort of how conflict sort of predicts whether there is a council present in Germany in the Middle Ages. And then it's a strong predictor. They're also doing an interesting thing here in the paper. Once again, you might imagine that conflict is not an exogenous variable. You need to find some sort of way of finding an instrument for conflict. What they do here is that they find the gender of the firstborn kid of a noble, and then they use it as an instrument towards conflict. And it turns out that if your firstborn kid is a daughter, then conflict is more likely, because it's more likely to have like a problem about succession. If your first kid is a boy, it's clear who the next king is going to be. If your first kid is a daughter, then there is like some succession sort of problem that might lead to conflict. Anyway, look it out if you're interested. Another example, Olson stationary bandits. Manjur Olson, amazing political scientist who was like one of the most influential figures of 20th century. He has this idea about how a stationary bandit evolves. So how a state evolves. He's saying that, look, what's bad for the society is having more than one bandits, armed groups, that go and rob citizens. If you have what he calls roving bandits, which are like different bandits competing over the control over the same region, that's terrible, because every day one of these bandits is going to come and steal something away, and then there is nothing left. If instead, if you have a stationary bandit, or what Olson calls a stationary bandit, that means that there is like a monopoly of violence in this region. And then the stationary bandit is going to realize that it doesn't make sense to steal everything from this region, because tomorrow I'm still going to be around, so there needs to be something to steal. So the stationary bandit, therefore, has the right incentives to sort of give people, give people incentives to invest. And then over the long run, Olson's theory is that the stationary bandit is really, it's just what its status, right? So it's sort of, it is a monopoly of violence over a region, and then it taxes people, right? So you might also see, like, I mean, argue, hey, okay, so, but then how does a stationary bandit evolve? There is a lovely paper by Raul Sanchez de la Sierra where he investigates the rise of monopoly of violence in Democratic Republic of Congo in early 2000s. Democratic Republic of Congo is famous for two minerals. One is gold, and the other one is coltan. And coltan we don't really use in our daily life that much, but it's a very popular mineral because specifically coltan is used in the production of CDs. I know that you are young, you don't use CDs anymore, but there was a time when I was at your age and we used CDs a lot. So it was like a very popular sort of medium. So for global reasons, the price of gold and price of coltan changes over time. Here is the price of gold in early 2000s. Especially after 2000, 2001, there is like a huge spike in the price of gold. Do you know what happened in 2001 that led to this like huge global insecurity that led to the increase in the demand for gold? That's 9/11, right? 9/11 happens, and then, you know, like globally, there is like a power imbalance, and then, you know, everything is uncertain, so people demand. Here's a more fun example. So let's look at the price of coltan in 2001. 2000 and 2001, huge jump, and then it kind of goes back. Do you know what happened in 2001 that led to this like huge increase in the price of coltan? It's actually like a more fun example. It turns out that Sony announced that they are going to develop PlayStation 2, which uses CDs. Now, you know, like all of a sudden the global coltan demand spikes up because everybody is going to have to use CDs, right? For whatever exogenous reason, these are not developments related to Democratic Republic of Congo, but it turns out that they change the price of coltan. So what he does in this paper, Raul Sanchez de la Sierra, is that he goes to DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and then surveys and understands whether there is like a monopoly of violence in a given region and how it changes with the price of coltan and price of gold. And it turns out that, for instance, an increase in the price of coltan increases the likelihood that there is a stationary bandit formed around the mine of coltan. An increase in the prices of gold increases the likelihood that there is a stationary bandit around the village where gold is extracted. So this brings the question of what is the difference between the mine and village, and sometimes why does this stationary bandit sometimes occur in villages and sometimes in mines? The answer here is that gold is very easy to conceal and then take it out of the mine. Therefore, you have to regulate the trade, overall trade. It's just not enough to put a armed bandit in front of the mine because they're not going to be able to control the price of gold. So you have to regulate the city. But coltan is very difficult to conceal, so it's enough to just put some stationary bandit around the coltan mine. There is a third theory, which is like a more the stationary bandits, and then the Thiele hypothesis, they're like very depressing theories of state, right? So it's like sort of monopoly of violence, etc. A more positive theory of state is John Locke, right? So it's coming from the idea that people sort of voluntarily give up their rights to the state. And why that does the state do? The state solves some of the collective action problems on their behalf, right? So it invests in public goods. If you just invest in public goods by yourself, that's not going to be enough, and etc. There is once again a lovely paper by Aylin Bartazini and Haldring that was published in 2023, where they are looking at these like historical river shifts in the Mesopotamia region. And in particular, like this is an amazing data set, first of all. I just want you to appreciate the sort of the scale of the ambition, right? So what they're looking here is that they are sort of looking at different sort of snapshots in time and looking at how the rivers are formed. And historically, river shifts all the time, right? So a river is not where they used to be like 100 years ago, and then it's not where it used to be like 200 years ago. So they are looking at these like sort of instances where the rivers shift, and they are specifying instances where there were cities where previously, before the river shift, these cities were around the river, and after the river shift, all of a sudden, these cities are left without any river. So their point here is that this shift of the river away from the city now creates this huge collective action problem. Previously, you could just easily water your fields. Now you have to set up an irrigation system to take care of it. And it's a public good, it's an investment that somebody has to take care of. So is it more likely that these cities are going to be more likely to set up with democratic institutions that resemble the institutions that we see now? And the answer is yes. It turns out that the river shift away from the city increases the likelihood that the city has a state, and then it increases the likelihood that the city forms a new state and not a previously existing state, and then it also increases the likelihood that the size of councils are larger, etc. Right? So basically, this is telling you that the moment that you have like a collective action problem to solve, then it becomes more likely that you set up an institution. That's one theory. That's one possible theory of institution evolution. Anyway, so to gather it all around, what I'm trying to say here is that institutional progress, institutional change is not easy. It requires different things to happen at the same time. First of all, there needs to be some sort of crisis. This is what Acemoğlu and Robinson call a critical juncture. There needs to be a point in history where our society is in crisis so that we know that we have to do a new thing. It could be external conflict. It could be changes in global economy, like price of gold, coltan. It could be river shift. But you need to have some sort of need for the change of institutions. On top of it, you need to have the right power structure, as we have seen from the North and Wine gas papers. You need to have the commitment power of the elites to sort of resolve this institutional inertia. Or you need to have like a threat of revolution that sort of comes from people being able to solve their collective action problems. On top of it, you need to have the right set of ideas. The people who demand change should know where to go, right? It's not an easy thing, these three things happening at once. But now that I know that I promised to talk about technology, let's try to apply this sort of framework to this like technological change. And I mean, of course, the next slide is going to be pure speculation, but I feel free to speculate on your own because you are going to be the real sort of people that are going to be impacted by this technological progress that has been happening for a while and that's going to keep happening, right? Will the advance in technology, AI and automation lead to institutional change, right? So I just argue that you need to have three different things to have institutional change. Let's see if we have these things, and if we don't, what type of things that we need. Do we have a major economic disruption that's caused by sort of technological change? I would argue yes, or like it's very soon that it's going to happen. Maybe it doesn't happen yet, but you know, there has already been growing inequality. There has been some labor displacement. It's going to speed up. So we are approaching towards a critical juncture. You also need the right type of power structure to sort of guide this transition and that maybe sort of allow us to set up a new institution. So that means that we really have to think about the control of data, who owns this data, the surveillance capacity of the states, which is sort of an important thing that we should really be worried about. Most of these like recent advances in AI like disproportionately benefit authoritarian states because they increase their surveillance capacity. So how can we think about sort of putting an obstacle in front of that and etc. And in particular, I mean, one other thing that I want to emphasize here is that so these historical changes in the economy also coincides with a region where historically the union power in most of the developed countries is very, very low. So that means that unions have very little power to sort of solve the collective action problem of the workers and etc. So really we have to think about how union power means in this setting and how to strengthen it. And also on top of it, we need to have the new ideas, which I think is the thing that I'm mostly worried about. Because we need to come up with ideas. And if you ask me to come up with an idea about how to design a new society, of course, I don't have a great answer because I'm not smart enough. But I'm hoping that one of you in this room is smart enough to come up with a new idea. And then hopefully it interacts with the right type of power structure to make it happen, right? So, but we need new ideas mostly through two channels. First of all, we need to have new ideas about the directions of technological progress. Technological progress is not exogenous. It depends on the type of investments that we are making at the frontier of the technology. And currently, honestly, these investments are only made by these like Silicon Valley billionaires that sort of have like a very narrow vision about what technological progress is. So we need to have, once again, a broader view. We need to have like a more participatory agenda about the future of democracy. How can you ensure this? Union power, probably one thing, and then, we need to come up with other ways of implementing this. On top of it, you need to have sort of, you need to have the right idea about what a new social order is going to look like and how do you legitimize this. We are going to have new ideas about privacy, digital freedom, and then maybe we are going to move to a society where we are going to have a universal basic income type of thing, right? So, this is something that a lot of people have envisioned, and some people have resistance towards it. People have different opinions. But my point here is that if you're just going to implement universal basic income, you're not going to be able to implement it by itself. You have to complement it with the right societal structure. What do I mean by this? In my view, once again, highly speculative. Feel free to disagree. We are living in a society that puts a lot of emphasis on your personal productivity to the overall economy. And your value as a citizen kind of comes from the productivity that you put into the economy. With the advancement of AI and automation, we are going to have to start thinking about a society where we put much, much less emphasis on this productivity and much more emphasis on other dimensions that justify you receiving a universal basic income. So basically, we need to come up with like a different way of defining what a productive and valuable citizen is. And I know that this is sort of easier said than done. It requires like a huge mentality change, but hopefully, once again, we are going to think about these issues in the future. All right, so once again, of course, this is not the end of the day, but maybe my hope is that the current literature on institutions that is heavily fed up on these like sort of past experiences, maybe they give us a framework to think about what happens in the future when we think about the technology. Thank you very much.